No one ever expected to have such a long war.
Looking at Israel now, what keeps you up at night?
The only real solution is having the ultra-Orthodox join the Israeli army.
Simple. Just make the Haredim enlist. It doesn't work that way.
Today we're helping actually nearly 40,000 families. And for everyone in Israel, it's what's happening in Iran. But for the reservist families, it means he or she might have to just pick up and leave.
Okay, Rachel is really just building what needs to be already in place from a governmental perspective. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Long Path podcast. I'm Amitai Freeman, and I am very excited to introduce you to our guest. This is our first episode of this season, and we will be discussing in this episode, but in general, some of the Jewish people's most pressing questions and topics, things that are top of mind for us, what's going on in Israel, what's going on in the diaspora, and of course in the relationship, and what are things we need to think about. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Rachel Azaria. She is a former member of Knesset, a former deputy mayor of the city of Jerusalem. She's an author of the book Guided Revolution, Amadricha Lemapecha. And today, and certainly since after 10/7, in the aftermath of 10/7, she founded HaOgen for Reservist Families. It's an organization which has supported over 35,000 reservist families across Israel through a network of 20,000 volunteers. She runs this organization. I know this is not the first time around in which she's been doing this type of work, and this will come up in our conversation. And I'm really excited to get started. And right before we do that, just a word on the name, The Long Path. We've been through a thing or two, the Jewish people, and we understand that the journey is long, it's difficult, it's got ups and downs, and we're trying to center that emotion or that feeling throughout these conversations to remind ourselves, remind our viewers and ourselves mostly that there's a long way to go. There's work to be done, and we're going to highlight people who are doing this work and really getting us through these moments. So without further ado, I'd love to start with Rachel. It's so good to see you. It's good to have you on the podcast, and let's jump into it.
Hi, very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. So we're gonna skip the small talk, Rachel. I know you and I could do that for hours, but we're looking at Israel today. We're kind of on the heels of this war, this over 2-year war that we had in Gaza. Those who read the news know it's not actually over, but the emotional weight that we felt because of the hostages certainly feels like there's a level or a stage that is done. But looking at Israel now, what keeps you up at night? What is the things that you really are worried about and thinking about on a regular basis?
So first of all, great question. As you said, I work with reservist families. And I'm a former member of the Israeli parliament. And when I was a member of the Israeli parliament, I was a member of the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee. And one of the assumptions, everything that had to do with war in Israel, was that wars in Israel would always be, or operations would always be around 6 weeks. And therefore, everything was organized counting on the reservists to be our major fighting units. So you have the people that are from the age of 18 to 21, okay, more or less. That's the regular army. Then you have those that stay for the professional army. But most of the army units, at the end of the day, most of the combat units at the end of the day are reservists. And it's okay because if you count on a max 6 to 8 week war, so you call them in, they do their job, and then they go back to their regular life, and everything is okay. No one ever expected to have such a long war. And before October 7th, in every given moment, there were more or less between 3,000 to 5,000 reservists in duty. Since on October 7th, 360,000 reservists were called in. Okay. Now, in every given moment, we're talking about if there's nothing going on, nothing in Iran, nothing in Syria and Lebanon and Judea, Samaria and Gaza, whatever. If everything is 100% peaceful or whatever, peaceful and whatever, not peaceful, if everything is the regular,
Stable.
baseline,
Yeah.
yeah, stable, we're talking about 40,000 reservists in every given moment.
Wow.
And now when you add the math together, put the math together, you're talking about between 2 to 3 months for every reservist in the coming 2 to 3 years. So this is one thing that keeps me up at night because I know the very, very high price these reservists pay, like the toll that they're carrying by doing their reserve duty. Talking about families, the relationships and the couples. We're talking about the children. We're talking about people losing their jobs. A lot of things that we couldn't talk about soon. And knowing that the only real solution to this challenge is having the ultra Orthodox join the Israeli army. That's the only real solution we have anywhere. And the ultra Orthodox community, I was deputy mayor of Jerusalem, Jerusalem city councilwoman. I worked very closely with the ultra Orthodox community in Jerusalem. 30% of the city are ultra Orthodox, and they have most of the power in the municipality. And the only real solution is that they will join the army, and they're doing everything they can not to join the Israeli army.
Yeah.
So when you ask me what keeps me up at night, I feel it's this joint challenge, which is at the end of the day, it's the same challenge, but also the challenge of the reservists, and also knowing that the only real solution is that the ultra Orthodox will join the Israeli army, and then that's the challenge with the ultra Orthodox in Israel.
Yeah. So that's thank you for sharing that part. I mean, I think that for folks who are not who don't live in Israel or are not familiar with the structure of reservists of the Miluim, it's such a foreign concept. Of people, of members of your family. It can be your father, your uncle, it can be your mother, it can be your sister, disappearing for a month, for two, for three, over the course of a year, and that's when things are stable. And it's a very foreign concept. And what you're describing, and I'm going to unpack this a little bit, and I want you to help
Yeah,
me kind of articulate this for the audience because obviously you and I know, there's a lot of things that we're kind of layering in, but there's some other elements that are important. So the first, when you say keeping you up at night, obviously the first number one thing is the immense toll that these families are paying. Uh, on top of that, you have the economy that's paying a price, right? You have the security issue. Okay.
yeah.
What happens when an army is stretched so thin? We have many borders. There could be flare-ups. You're talking about 30, 40,000 on a stable time. What happens when
40,
things
40,
40,
50. Yeah.
40 to
Hmm.
50,000,
And
all the
stable.
more so. Yeah. And
Yeah.
when it's stable, what happens when things could flare
Yeah.
up? And as we've seen the past few years, they can easily flare up. The Middle East is
Yeah.
not a quite not known for its stability. So
Yeah.
there's a security element, but
Yeah.
and then so there's so how do we alleviate those? And once we start talking about the solution for alleviating this, we're introducing a whole other issue that's keeping us up
Exactly.
at night, which is the social contract in Israel, which presumes that we have folks who are carrying the burden equally, or at least somewhat equally, and contributing to society both on the economic, but also on the security and the defense, and kind of spreading this diffusing the weight, the burden across many more shoulders will make a lot of this much easier. So when you factor in like the only solution is is one of the biggest social rifts within Israel. These are norms that have been set in place since the founding of the state. There's
Exactly.
expectation, there's political power, there's so much going on. And I think that for people from the outside, it might seem, simple, right? Just make the Haredim enlist. You just can't make the Haredim enlist. It doesn't
Yeah.
work that way. So yeah, that's quite the weight. But Rachel, this isn't the first time you're doing this type of work, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you want to walk us a little bit for a second, and we'll get to the meaty questions, but I think it's important people understand because it's also when you and I first connected, 12 years ago, I believe.
Yeah.
Um,
Almost 12
but
years ago.
yeah,
Yeah.
but which is more demonstrating why this is a lasting issue. But like
Yeah.
where like starting HaOgen, getting involved with these families, what was the background there for you?
So, like many Israeli women, and today also men, because women are more in combat than in the past. So, like many Israeli women, my husband did a lot of reserve duty, a lot for years, and he also participated in operations. And it was very hard for me. Also, technically, because I was always career oriented. and also emotionally. This kind of moment that your life, he suddenly gets called in and he kisses you goodbye and the kids and whatever, and he's gone, and that's it. And you're like, what are you supposed to do? And, that's it. That's what's happening. And then you need to take over everything and figure out. I think every career woman can, even not like every woman can appreciate how difficult it is that your husband is suddenly, or your spouse, whatever, suddenly called in. And you're worried, and he's in combat, and so this is like a very strong experience that I have. Like I even say that it's memory in my body. Like I get goosebumps whenever I talk about it.
Yeah.
Um, and then during Protective Edge, uh,
That
over,
was in 2014, Protective
yeah,
Edge.
yeah,
I lost
2014.
count. I can't. I
Yeah,
forget the
yeah,
names of
yeah,
the years,
yeah.
but yeah,
I know. It
yeah,
was 2014. I was deputy mayor of Jerusalem at the time. My list for city council, my party, we were talking a lot about early childhood and young families. So everyone was like, okay, how do we help the reservists? How do we help that? Da, da, da. And I was like, wait, hold on. Every time there is an operation or a war, everyone looks at the front lines, but there is a large group of people like families, reservist families that are not in the front lines, but
yeah,
they need support because
yeah,
they're like little front lines, you
yeah.
know,
It's not
around
by
the city.
accident that it's called the home front.
Yeah.
That it's really happening. The Orif is the home front, and that's where it
Yeah.
happens. But sorry, yeah,
So I posted on Facebook, this is 12 years ago, and I asked people, or 11 and a half, whatever, I asked people if they want to come and volunteer
yeah,
and help reservist families. And people came in. And we started calling reservist families, asking them if they need help. And by the end of the operation, which was 6 weeks, like usually it is in Israel, we were helping 500 families in Jerusalem. And it was one of the most heartwarming operations I've ever organized. We had volunteers babysitting, meal cooking, taking the dog on a walk, helping out, like everything that needed help. We were there. We were like this extra pair of hands. And also, we gave people the feeling that they're part of a community, that they're not
mm,
alone. Because something that makes it very hard is that suddenly you're alone with your kids. Not everyone has family, that can come and help and do everything that's needed. And then October 7th. And October 7th, this time, I'm not in any, like any position. I'm not member of parliament. I'm not deputy mayor. Like, I'm not in any official position. I'm actually working to establish a relationship between Judaism and democracy. Like, that was my thing.
yeah,
And also cooperating with Z3 and that kind of work.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and Sunday, October 7th. And like everyone around me is called in. It's like that's what happened. There were no men in the street, no young women in the streets. Like everyone was called in. And the same day, October 7th at night, I watched the prime minister. He gave this, speech. And I was thinking, okay, what should I do the same thing as I did, during Protective Edge? And I was hesitant, I wasn't sure. And as I'm kind of thinking about it, I got a note on Facebook from a woman from Jerusalem saying, are you going to be doing the same thing? I remember you helped us 9 years ago.
Yeah.
Then I had my first, now I have 4 kids. Do you think you'll organize the same kind of thing? And I was like, okay, if someone remembers and I guess it's important enough. I posted on Facebook, opened a WhatsApp group, called a few women that were with me the time before, got a few volunteers together. And we told people if you want to organize this kind of assistance in your city or community, join us. I'll teach you how to do it. You'll be part of this. And long story short, that's how we founded HaOgen, the anchor for reservist families. And today we're helping actually nearly 40,000 families. This is like
Wow.
this huge, yeah, it's a huge operation. We're
Yeah.
working in 700 communities around the country.
In
It's
all
really,
communities. I think this is something that people don't
yeah,
fully appreciate. I know this firsthand because, you know, my Abba happens to be a volunteer, right? He tells me
yeah,
stories of where he goes. But I think that most people, or not, might imagine this to being okay, so you're only helping one segment of society. But if you can maybe
no,
like the geographic spread and yeah,
yeah. It's
yeah,
from Kiryat Shmona, like from the kibbutzim in the north on the border till Eilat. We have everywhere.
yeah,
We have volunteers helping in any possible way, like the same thing, the meal cooking and dog walking and babysitting and helping with the kids in the afternoon and all of the like handyman kind of helping around the house that needs to
yeah,
be done. And also with the meal cooking, someone cooks the meal and someone needs to drive the meal, like bring it to. So we also have those kind of volunteers. Laundry folding,
yeah.
laundry is always a big deal. We have
Oh, that's a
laundry,
big deal.
everything. And also I'll say that as time went by, because the way we organize is that we have a city coordinator, and they're in touch, or community coordinator, they're in touch with hundreds of families usually.
Right.
And then every family, like she's like a big sister, okay? And as time went by, they started asking her for help in other areas. Like suddenly
Mm.
they needed help, couple therapy, help with early
Wow.
childhood, yeah, stress, early childhood stress. Now there's a lot of issue with teenagers.
Yeah.
Um, and then we have also the um, financial challenges, we have financial support, women that have to start new jobs. At the beginning, it was like this whole that suddenly he left or she left. We have also
Right.
mothers, also fathers, like they left, will be here to help. And as time went by, it became, how do you deal with this ongoing burden, and how do you like do everything that needs to be done, and how do you deal with the emotional challenge? We have a lot of divorces, separations, PTSD, a lot of PTSD. It's this is like these are challenges that we don't know how to deal with. We need new protocols.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you deal with these challenges? We've never
Yeah.
had such a long war. We never had reservists on and off, going back and forth. And even if it's only 3 months next year, first of all, it's a long time. And secondly, um, even if you have a date when these 3 months will be, everything can change, in a moment. Like
Yep.
for the past few weeks, everyone was like, what's happening in Iran? What's happening in Iran? What's happening in Iran? And for everyone in Israel, it's what's happening in Iran, what's happening in, what's
Yeah.
going to happen in the United States. So, but for the reservist families, it means, he or she might have to just pick up and leave in
Yeah.
every given moment. So
Yeah.
it's a lot to hold on to. Like
Yeah.
this, like
Yeah.
another layer of stress and another layer of stress, another layer of stress.
Yeah, and it doesn't relent. It's just ongoing. And I think, as you're describing and sharing, how you've built this HaOgen, it's quite remarkable because it did start as really a volunteer initiative. And I remember conversations of like, do I actually turn this into an organization? Because I want to
Yeah,
do this afterwards. But the needs, what you're describing, I'm like, okay, Rachel is really just building what needs to be already in place from a governmental perspective, right? Social services. Israel is at the end of the day a fairly, at least from a social perspective, it's a social or community. We have the United Healthcare that we have.
yeah,
The education system is funded by the government in the country. So it would make sense that we would have some kind of agency that knew how to support its citizens in this moment, because what you're describing it's not only, of course, the security, but there are going to be real ramifications that, look, I don't know. And I honestly don't know. This is out of place of ignorance. But as you said, there were probably other moments in our history where we had this type of generational impact due to war. I imagine after, 48, of course, or Yom Kippur,
48. Yeah.
And Yom Kippur probably, we know the whole thing with
Yeah.
these widows that,
A lot
Yom
of PTSD. Yom
Yeah,
Kippur War.
yeah,
I'll say, there are actually a lot of people that suffered from PTSD that now, because of this war, are finally being,
treated.
acknowledged.
Yeah, acknowledged,
People
treated.
that
Yeah,
50 years ago, Yom Kippur War is 50 years
50
ago.
years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what has dramatically shifted is the awareness around it.
Yeah.
Like which is huge. As someone who served, I think Israelis in general have everybody has some level of PTSD. How complex it is depending on your context and where what you experienced. But um, so it's a positive that we're aware of it. But what it also exposed is that we are totally not equipped. And there are some wonderful organizations, but they're entirely overwhelmed. They're entirely overwhelmed. So my question is like, okay, what? How, so many questions. How do we get to this moment where the government is so blind and unaware of this deep need? I mean, you've raised it 12 years ago, and nothing. And now it doesn't seem like things are shifting. We've all watched these hearings in the Knesset where you have PTSD soldiers there and families, and maybe give us some insight of what's going on there in
Yeah.
that side of things.
So I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I'm not sure the government should like run HaOgen. Like, but I think it should be an organization that is very dramatically supported by the government. I'll just say I think it's harder for people to volunteer because the government asks them.
Right.
It's easier
Well,
because
the
they're part of
army,
this organization. What?
well, the Miluim structure in a way, you're
Yeah.
drafted,
Yeah.
but that's
Yeah,
also,
I know. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know. We have to figure it out and we'll think
yeah,
about it. But I'm saying it could be like a semi kind of organization.
yeah,
Um, and also the army, don't forget that when you're right about what you're saying, that people continue volunteering, but you have this big, kind of 3 years of bonding
yeah,
with
yeah,
your
yeah, yeah.
with
Of
your
course.
gang in the army, with your
Yeah.
pals,
Yeah, and
and
you're
then you
accountable
come
to
back.
them.
So,
Yeah, you're accountable to
the-
them. That's the unit.
yeah,
No,
so
and,
it's
and of
kind of
course, yeah,
yeah.
and of course,
So
security. You're like survival
yeah,
versus,
yeah, yeah,
you have to volunteer to fold laundry, or you want to volunteer and go fight a
yeah.
war. Like,
So yeah, so
yeah,
this is kind of that, but that's one thing. But I do think the government needs to be part of this. What's happening in Israel now, unfortunately, is that we have a government that is trying to survive
yeah,
in like any in like and under any circumstance, like they'll do anything they can to survive. And the challenge that we have is that the government is leaning on the ultra-Orthodox,
yeah,
that they are not willing to join the army. They're not willing to, to be part of this burden. They're not willing to take responsibility. And this is very hard.
yeah,
So the government is doing everything they can to basically ignore what's happening. Um, because otherwise the government will collapse. Like there is big legislation that is the government is trying to pass that was supposed to be legislation that will force the ultra-Orthodox to join the army. And it became legislation that basically makes the ultra-Orthodox will not have to join the army because of this legislation. And those are the big fights. The Security and Foreign Affairs Committee.
yeah.
Yeah, we see
And
that's what's happening there because that's the discussion about the legislation.
yeah, so I let's try to unpack that because there are a lot of people who are going to hear this are not going to understand like there was legislation that was put forth that will force the ultra-Orthodox to volunteer. And we say force, it's usually, correct me if I'm wrong, is through negative measures. In other words, sanctions. If you don't do your part, then
Yeah,
here's a list of sanctions.
yeah,
And somehow through political, maneuvering and whatever, it somehow sounds on paper like it still is enforcing these personal sanctions, but ultimately actually solidifies this allowance
yeah.
um, to continue not serving.
So we'll start with this. When the state of Israel was born, the ultra-Orthodox got from Ben Gurion a permit of 400 ultra-Orthodox students to stay and study. When Begin got into power in 1977, sorry, 1977.
77. Yeah.
No, yes. When Begin got in power, 1977, he changed the legislation, and he promised the ultra-Orthodox that they won't have to join the army as long as they study. But still, a lot of them would, study for a few years and then join the army. As time went by, everything became more and more like they tied it, and strengthened it more and more and more. And today, basically, ultra-Orthodox simply don't go to the army. It's not they go a little older. That's not they just don't go to the army.
Yeah.
And for, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, there was this group of people that went to the Supreme Court and said, it doesn't, what's this whole concept? They just don't go to the army. We need them to go to the army. It's not fair. And like this whole thing was about, it has to be fair. The burden has to be divided in a fair manner. Okay.
Yeah.
And the discussion and the Supreme Court went forever. And they kept telling the government, they're right. The people that went to the Supreme Court, you can't do this because, you have to organize it in legislation. And time after time, the government tried to write up legislation, and the ultra-Orthodox didn't let it happen. And then the government kept asking the Supreme Court for another year and another year, and then whatever to figure out how to make it work, and to figure out how to whatever write up this legislation that will work, a bill that will work. And they didn't manage. And then came October 7th. And two things happened. First of all, the Supreme Court said, that's it, game over. What you're doing is illegal. And the second thing that happened is that if before it was, it's not fair and the burden has to be fair, now the discussion is different. This is not working anymore. It's not about, it's not about like a child that says, oh, not fair. No, like and not that that's what they said before, but some people said, stop talking about fairness. Everyone does something else in society, whatever. That whole story is game over.
Yeah.
It really, really, really doesn't work. So then they started writing up legislation so, they can go to the Supreme Court and say, here, we wrote up the legislation. Everything we're doing is according to the legislation that we wrote, and then it would be illegal because otherwise the ultra-Orthodox that don't join the army, it's basically illegal. And I'll say that what's happening today is that ultra-Orthodox, a lot of them, like the young ones, can't leave the country because there's sanctions on them because that they're not going to the army, because it's illegal for them not to go to the army, what was before considered legal till the Supreme Court verdict. So there's this legislation that they're working on, but basically what they're doing is that because the government is working very hard to please the ultra-Orthodox. So we had a chairperson of the committee, Yuli Edelstein from the Likud. He was the chairperson of the Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee working on the legislation. And because he didn't agree to do what the ultra-Orthodox wanted him to do, he got removed from being the chairperson. And today we have Boaz Bismuth. He's also from the Likud, and he's basically writing up the legislation that will make it legal for the ultra-Orthodox not to join the army. Now, he can't do it. He can't just say, okay, just don't join the army because it will get people very, very upset. And so what they're doing is that they're building this, we call it like Swiss cheese, okay? For the next year and a half, need to join the army. I think it's something like 13,000, but the 13,000 it's during a year and a half. So the first year it's 5,000. The 5,000, if 10% don't join, it's okay because you got 90%. If of the 90%, also 10% can go and do other work and not reserve duty and not join the army. And of those that join the army, if the Minister of Defense and Security says that the army didn't do enough of an effort to make sure that the army is suitable for the ultra orthodox. So even these 5,000 that are left or 3,000 don't really need to join. I'm basically building this whole building saying they don't really need to join the army. And
Yeah.
so this is something that's getting people very upset. And I'll also say that there's another, big bell that's being rung, like that's ringing, is that the army service in Israel was shortened. It used to be 3 years for men.
Yeah.
Now it's shorter. It's 2 years and 9 months. And basically, it needs to grow again. It needs to be 3 years, even 3 years and a bit. And the Israeli nation will not accept adding more months to the regular soldiers in Israel while the ultra Orthodox are being freed of any duty, any duty. So I'm trying to like give you the picture of this chain that's happening, okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
They can't pass this legislation. The Supreme Court decide they can't pass the legislation for the regular soldiers. The Supreme Court made the decision about the legislation, and therefore the ultra Orthodox, these youngsters can't leave the country, can't do this, can't do that. And then they're trying to pass the legislation, but they're trying to do something that can never work. So they're doing this kind of Swiss cheese, and then they're trying to prove that it would, and it's whatever, a big mess. I think I think that some people have this naive vision of the ultra Orthodox that, they're slowly but surely things will change. Um, I must say, I used to be, in a sense, kind of part of this group. You can even find these op-eds that I wrote years ago, like, 10 years ago or whatever, about how, in Jerusalem, we understand the ultra Orthodox, and whoever goes and fights them, those are people that don't really want to see, don't want to see them joining Israeli society. You need to do things slowly and, cautiously. And that's what will make the change happen. And we need to do it in their terms, and they're part of our nation. But 10 years later, I can say that it's just not true. They don't
Yeah.
want to join the army. They don't want to become part of Israeli society. I'm saying they, even though it's probably 90% of the ultra Orthodox. I mean,
Yeah.
10% might be different, but
It's
yeah,
besides the look, I understand the language, the need to hedge it and say, well, we don't mean everybody, but the point, the fact of the matter is that their leadership,
yeah.
okay, is
But
is is is
the
is
leadership, but also the people. And it's
yeah,
important to say, I
certainly.
mean, yeah,
Yeah.
10%, 10%, I think, whatever. And I'm being even very, very generous in
Generous.
this
Yeah.
assumption of
Yeah.
10%. But whatever, there are some. But the
Yeah.
society is a society.
Yeah.
They have,
Yeah.
they don't want to become part of Israeli
Yeah.
society. Not today.
This is what people, when we say that, when we say that the ultra Orthodox community isn't Zionist, right? What we're really saying, right, is that they treat, we talk about the return to our land and having sovereignty in a country, in a society, a functioning society and a democracy. We consider that as a huge step forward in this kind of this dream that we've had for thousands of
Yeah.
years,
Yeah.
carry Jews throughout time. What people I think, don't fully understand is that the ultra Orthodox, despite living in Israel, still believe that they are in Gullus, right? That they're still in Galut, that they haven't returned, and they don't treat Israel as their country. They treat
No.
it as a country that they need to um, coexist with and utilize for their own for their
Yeah,
survival.
and find a way to get the maximum they can
Yeah.
for their society.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
people would say to that, will say, okay, what do you want? As we say, don't hate the player, hate the game. What do you want? You're allowing for it. The system, Ben Gurion started it. Begin made it worse. And quite frankly, Rachel, like I don't remember what year this was, but there was a year, and of course, it was short-lived, but there was a year where there was a coalition that had no Haredim in it,
There were a
right?
few. It happened a few times
Yeah, a
along the
few times. But
years.
even in recent memory, I'm saying like in the past 10
Yeah,
years, 70, right?
yeah,
And it suddenly, all the issues that synagogue and state, we'll call them, were not dealt with because everybody knows that at some point they're going to have to rely on the Haredim and the
Yeah.
ultra-Orthodox for their coalition, and they
Everyone is
cannot.
afraid of that.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they say, okay, even we have this government now, and let's fix everything. They know that the elections, something else is going to happen. The
And
government will fall, and they'll have to
mhm.
sit with the Haredim, and
Yeah.
and it's unbelievable. So I think that's like part of what, for folks who are not in it and live outside of Israel, don't fully, they can't fully appreciate the layers of how it's not a difficult, it's an unbelievably complex situation. I too was one of those like give them time and slowly, and as you said, game over. I'm sorry. It's not soon enough and fast enough. And we both know wonderful people who are doing their best to try and move the needle, but that would have been, and they've been
It's
doing
not
it for a
moving.
while,
Yeah.
but it's not moving. It's not
Yeah,
moving.
it's not moving.
It's not
And I'd
moving.
say also something else that I think, it's also we don't have time. And also I think that Israeli society was shocked by the fact that when they were most needed, they were just like, it's
They were
not our
apathetic.
project.
They were apathetic. It was
Yeah.
unbelievable. And people said, oh, they went and they gave food. The people who gave food were probably the 10% that are
Yeah.
interested in in participating. They don't know what else to do. Right?
I went to a wedding, a relative of mine, like many families in Israel have a ultra-Orthodox branch.
Yeah.
And there was a wedding. It was in one of these horrible weeks. We went to funerals and to Shivas and in HaOgen. We had some casualties and friends of ours. Like it was really one of those really, really, really bad times. And went to a wedding of
Yeah.
one of my ultra-Orthodox relatives. And then, towards the end of the wedding, it's all separate. But towards the end, people kind of, grape up outside and start talking, men and women. And one of my relatives came up and was like, "Oh, Racheli, that's how I'm called at home. Oh, so good to see you. How are you doing?" It was like, and his face was light up. Really, we're very friendly and happy
Yeah.
and close and
Family.
whatever.
Yeah.
And he said, "How are you doing?" I said, "These are very hard times." So he was like, "Oh no, Racheli, what happened?" And I was like, "It's war." And his only reaction was like, "Oh." And the conversation was over. Like
Yeah.
the gap was so big. And this is something that a lot of people describe in this time, like, everyone is miluim and reserve and they're coming back and this and that, and you run to the supermarket to buy something because he's leaving again. He came back for 12 hours, a little war and everything, and then you meet in the supermarket a ultra-Orthodox relative. They're like, "Oh, how are you doing?" Like, "Okay, how are you doing?" "Oh, we're going from one good news to the other. We married our son, we're going to marry our daughter." And they're like, "What?"
Where do you live? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think what you're uncovering here, I mean, it's incredibly painful. And I have to say that, I struggle, because on the one hand, you want like it's maddening. First of all, I'll name the irony of, living in America and not doing miluim, right? Like seeing that. That's first of all like there's irony to like my level of anger. Not to go too much into it of the exemptions and whatever. It's not that if I would be in Israel, I would be called up. But that's besides the point. But there's but that's for me on a very basic level of discomfort with this conversation. I am trying to be a little bit empathetic and try to be a little bit understanding, but I'll admit that it's hard. It's very hard to
It's hard.
extend it because it's just so much. It's just so much. And the reason, and our politicians are doing a good job of like instigating and getting us angry because it works. And I'm trying to hold on to that. But what you're describing here as well, which I find interesting, which is very different from our context here as living Jewishly outside of Israel, is this reality where you have close familial relationships that interact in a fairly consistent way that has an entirely different experience. And this is true not only like, ultra Orthodox and I mean, you're Orthodox or observant, but even like people who are totally secular, right, have that, but also politically. And this fact of running into each other into the supermarket and working together and for the most part living, in a kind of what we call like forced proximity creates a what I'd call a robustness or resilience to Israeli democracy that sometimes people don't always understand from the outside. And I was curious if you have, you served as a member of Knesset, so you saw that from one side, who you would ally with in in the Knesset, who you'd have to work with, right? And also now in the Ogen, as an activist and before Ogen, like working within the community and seeing how these things. So I would love to hear a little bit more about like the robustness of the Israeli democratic kind of nature, because I think that's something that outside of Israel we're very worried about, and we'd love to hear a little bit of your insight on that.
So I'll say a few things. First of all, I think that we have very, very strong communities. I think that's something that it's like when I think about HaOgen for reservist families, how it operates and how it's like so surprising. I mean, who would imagine that for over 2 years, people will still be volunteering? And it's
Yeah,
because we have these very close relationships. And also, there's something very like the way we very much behave like this one big family. I think that's also why we're so upset with ultra Orthodox.
yeah.
But I saw something online, whatever, that when do you know where you're an Israeli? When you yell at someone else's child
Yeah.
at the park. And it's
Yeah.
not rude. It's
Yeah.
not rude.
Yeah.
Like, of
Yeah.
course, and also at the same time, if someone, in the park there, you made sandwiches for your kids, obviously a lot of other kids will come and ask. And of course, it's like there's something about Israel that
Yeah.
it's just the way we do things. So that's how we can also have people, come in, fold laundry for people that they don't know. I mean, that's something,
Yeah.
it's a concept that could be so embarrassing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's okay, or come into someone's house and people do that and people trust people.
Yeah.
Um, you know, so I think that's something that's very important to understand. Talking about Israeli democracy, I have a lot of faith in our people because we're so highly invested in this country.
Mm.
In so many ways. Everything we have here is because we worked very hard for it to happen. So in that sense, I'm more optimistic, but our democracy is messy. We're a very young democracy. Being young democracy is always challenging.
From an activist perspective, from the societal perspective, in America we talk a lot about like a polarized country, right? And this idea that identities stack, right? If you're typically, you're probably from a specific socioeconomic layer, you probably live in a specific geographic region, you
Mhm.
probably believe have a certain faith, right? And then your voting
And if
patterns.
you're a Democrat, you probably in a high percentage of the Democrats have never really talked to Republicans, and a high
Exactly,
percentage of
exactly. So
Republicans never
there's so
really
there's
talked to
like so you
Democrats.
have these stacked
Yeah,
identities and they don't
yeah,
interact, what you described earlier
yeah,
of like going to a wedding. Here we
yeah,
talk about,
yeah,
we talk about the crazy uncle we meet. It's always an uncle, by the way. I don't know why, but your crazy Republican uncle that you meet once a year in Thanksgiving, if not less, right? But in Israel, it's like, no, every Shabbat dinner I'm talking to someone I
yeah.
disagree with. At least, if not sooner than that, and more frequently than that. And I think that there's a misunderstanding there, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this, is that Israel might be very messy and very fragmented, but it isn't polarized. That's to say, there isn't like two camps. There are
Mm,
many
yeah,
weird, overlapping, highly contested issues that we talk about, which makes it very, very messy and stressful and could be extreme. But it isn't, this imagination of like, the country split in two is something that is maybe not really real
yeah.
on the ground.
I agree. First of all, I think that the Orthodox have a lot of it, like the modern Orthodox, because every family, has an ultra Orthodox branch and someone that stopped being Orthodox, okay, became
Yeah,
secular. And then you have these Shabbat dinners. I can say that we don't talk about politics. And my parents, like my siblings, we
yeah.
we don't talk about politics. If we try tapping into it, even a teeny bit, it's nothing good will happen. We had one day that, someone brought up politics, and it was interesting because it was like more of a distant family, and I could see how everyone got so nervous. I was like,
Yeah,
"Oh,
yeah, yeah.
don't you know we don't do this?" Yeah, I was like, "Oh my God, what's going to happen?" Nothing happened, by the way,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
everyone was terrified. It was interesting to see how it was like more the distant relatives
yeah.
that, you know, like people that just married into the family and were like, "Oh,
Mm,
didn't you get the memo?"
yeah.
Yeah, no, we don't talk
Someone
about
told them, it's like,
politics.
oh, we talk about politics. We thought try sending in the family, and it's like a
Yeah, no,
hazing in a moment. Yeah,
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 no, we don't do that. And I think a lot of families don't talk about politics, and WhatsApp groups don't talk about politics.
yeah,
It's a thing, and it's interesting because before the war, before October 7th, there was a lot that was going on, with the
yeah,
demonstrations and the
yeah. And
legislations that
still,
the
and
government tried to
still, yeah,
pass. Yeah. But and like then the war, at the beginning of the war, it was like, we're all united, and very quickly, this like I think that the like a very, very deep pain started coming up. And that's a lot of the relationship with the ultra Orthodox, which is also very interesting because a lot of right wing are very much pro having the ultra Orthodox join the army. What's
yeah,
happening today is that a lot of the reservist families, not whatever, there's, as expected, a nice percentage of the reservist families which are Orthodox, like not necessarily modern Orthodox, but like even more
yeah,
Orthodox.
yeah.
Okay,
More
they're not
right
ultra
wing. Yeah,
Orthodox.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that two things happened. First of all, hearing the ultra Orthodox saying, they can't join the army; they need to learn
Study
Torah.
Torah. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and then they say, we do both. We've been doing both, and we can do it.
yeah,
And I think also this
yeah.
very
There's
deep,
this. Yeah. Sorry, no, I was gonna
yeah,
say there's this. I had a conversation with someone in a context of this. Sorry, just to make it like a finer
yeah,
point in it. The Haredi claim was like, no one promises me that my son will come back religious,
yeah,
and the response is, no one is promising that my son will come
I'll
back.
come back.
Period.
Yeah,
And there's like this like disconnect of like
yeah.
what is at stake here. Sorry, go ahead. It's just
Yeah,
such a
no,
stark.
no,
Yeah,
definitely. And I
yeah,
think that also what happened was that a lot of the Orthodox realized that the ultra Orthodox don't think of what we're doing as really learning, like Torah learning.
yeah,
Like they see themselves as the only real Jews,
yeah,
basically. And we're all kind of this, unclear floating kind of group, whatever. And I think that that's also a big, I think that for many years there were a lot of within the Orthodox, there were like, people that related more to the secular and people that related more to the ultra Orthodox. I think that the people that related more to the ultra Orthodox, their shock is even bigger.
mm,
There is now in the government and in the more right-wing press, they're trying to like say that the Orthodox that are pro having the ultra-Orthodox join the army, they are basically left-wing people that are trying to crash, the
the
Israeli
government.
government, but it's not,
Yeah,
it's very hard to convince that. Yeah.
it's so interesting to like to it's there's so much that's going on here. I mean, I think that like if before the war we talked about this idea that the big argument was between the Jewish and democratic nature of Israel,
Yeah.
right? And so a lot of people on the right were like, yeah, I'm more on the Jewish side of the conversation. What you're describing now is that internally in the group that would might find themselves in the Jewish side of the
Right. Yeah.
equation, right, are now being told that their Jewishness isn't enough, right?
Their Jewishness isn't enough. And also
Yeah,
part of it, like this Jewishness, or the part of like Judaism versus democracy, the Judaism part is, what they went against the Supreme Court was because the Supreme Court doesn't protect the Israeli soldiers. That was the claim.
right,
Okay.
right.
I perceive it differently, but it doesn't matter. And then suddenly,
The Supreme
the
Court is,
members of this group that is like more Jewish, they're not
yeah,
here to protect Israeli soldiers. They're not here to protect like our national part of being Jewish. There's the
yeah,
religious part and the national
national
part.
problem. Yeah,
So there are these religious people that are, first of all, telling the other people you're not Jewish enough. And then the very religious people that are saying, we don't care about the national part of the
mm,
Jewishness.
yeah,
So it's like there are a lot of, but it's very
yeah,
hard. Still, we are. we are polarized. I mean, in a
Yeah.
different way, but we are. And we
Yeah.
see like this pain, the pain is very big.
Yeah. Yeah. The pain is very big. It's huge. I mean, it's not the point that was not that there isn't issues, right? Of course, there's a lot of pain in it, but so I've you know, I've, we don't have a ton of time left. I don't want to be respectful of all that. It's, even though there's a lot that I want to cover, but much of what you're discussing, and I feel it, and I also hear it. There's a sense of like a lack of trust, deep lack of trust, pointed in all kinds of directions, right? Towards the government that's gonna fumble this somehow and do this Swiss cheese model of something. The ultra Orthodox community that are not gonna that with the disappointment and almost their disappointment of their response to 10/7. Um, Different parts of society. How do we in order to move forward, um, to start thinking about moving forward, my sense is that trust is a big piece of it. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how do we address the lack of trust and how do we start rebuilding it?
So I believe I agree. There's a lot of lack of trust, but I think a lot of the lack of trust is towards the government. I think that we have built a lot of trust within Israeli society. And I want to go back to HaOgen, the anchor for
Yeah.
reservist families. We we have done something that is, I don't know, to me it's almost a miracle. I think altogether, this whole concept of so many people volunteering for such a long time. And I say also the volunteers are very, you have Orthodox volunteering for secular, and we work with the Druze community, volunteers from the Druze community, and you have young and old and people that don't know each other, and it's like this thing works. And I believe that the future of Israeli society lies in these areas. Like,
Mm,
instead of talking about what separates us, we have to find a common or like a idea that we all work towards.
mm,
Like, even when you think about the Israelites when they left Egypt, okay? So the beginning was very hard, and they were complaining about this, complaining about that, again and again and again, and also Moshe and also God. They were like, "Oh, what do we do with them? They're impossible." And then Moshe went to get the Torah, and then suddenly they went and they built the golden
yeah, the golden calf. Yeah.
the golden calf, and it's like, oh no, and then there is a moment that I think that suddenly God understands, and he's like, let's have them build together the Mishkan, like the temple.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting moment because they're like, okay, let's build a temple. And suddenly there's this long list of how all of like, everyone came to join in. The
Mm,
men brought this, the women did this, they this, did this, and everyone was like, let's do, let's
yeah.
do, let's do, let's do. And they do, and they do, and they do together, together, together,
Yeah.
together, and so excited. And then there's a moment that like they come and they tell Moshe, we have too much. They're giving
Yeah.
too much. They're
Too much.
doing
Yeah.
too much. It's a big mess. Tell them to stop
Yeah.
donating, and then like there's a shofar, like like, stop
Yeah.
donating, stop donating. And I think that what we do very well when things fall apart is like do good together.
Mm,
We know how to do that. We're trained for it. I think that when things got so messy in Israel and everything collapsed around us, the first few weeks after October 7th, everyone was busy doing good in the same way. And like all the soldiers were like, don't send us cakes anymore. We can't eat them. We have
we
to
can't
like
afford the dentist bill. Just give us.
don't send cakes,
Yeah.
don't buy packages, don't send socks, don't send
Yeah.
anything. Like, and
Yeah.
also the people that were evacuated, they were in the
Yeah.
hotels, and people were like, I have a friend that was evacuated. I came to visit her one day, and like trucks coming in with more and more merchandise. And they're like, don't send anything anymore. And like, this is what we do when things get
Yeah.
very hard. We do good together. That's our tag for
Yeah.
HaOgen for Reservist Family, doing good
Good
together.
together. Yeah.
Okay, so it's like,
Yeah.
and I think that's what we know how to do. So I think that the more we find um, ideas or areas that have to be taken care of, and we can do them as an Israeli group together, Like, I think that's our future.
Yeah,
So I'm not sure how it's going to meet Israeli politics. I think that I hope there are going to be elections soon. And, I'm bringing a bit of my perspective. I don't think that this government can continue the way it's working. But I think that after that happens, there's still a lot of work to gain the trust again of the nation, and
yeah.
also to
Close that
diminish
gap.
the
Close
gap.
that gap. Yeah,
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 close the gap between Israeli politics and the nation. And in the meantime, I think there's a lot of work that has to be done to get the nation to work together on different concepts and
yeah,
different like ideas and like ideology and things that we all can kind of tap into. So
yeah. So, um, there's a lot at stake here at the end of the day, and I want to, we're going to start doing this. The podcast, we call it now, the long path, right? Because we believe that it's a long, long way to go, a lot of work. And I want to ask for two. I'm going to ask you, what do you think might happen if things don't change and we go one way? That's the first part, right? What's at stake? And then after that, what does it look like when we do make the right decisions? And we don't have to talk like there's a lot of decisions that need to be made, not to go into the decisions that need to happen, but where do we need to be? Where should we be headed? So where we might be going and where do we want to go and how does that look
how many
like?
years are you giving me? Like, what do we?
I mean, that's a good one. I don't know. I think that let's
Are we
let's go
talking about
to
like a decade,
let's
20
talk about a
years?
decade. Let's do a decade. Let's do a
Decade.
decade. Yeah, let's do a decade.
Um, I think that we will have to, um, tap into this challenge with the ultra-Orthodox. We won't be able to avoid this anymore. We'll have to have a government that's willing to pay prices and, a prime minister that's willing to maybe lose a seat. And maybe he won't be prime minister again because he'll do this work. But we
Yeah.
need someone that's willing to do it and know
Yeah.
that they left an important mark on Israeli society, and maybe they'll pay the political price.
Yeah.
So that's number one. Number two, I think that we need to redesign our democratic system, make it much more organized. Like, we need to have a constitution. We need to, make very serious decisions and organize it. And that's going to be hard because the people that are in power never want to change the rules of the game if it doesn't benefit them. So this is a big issue.
Yeah.
Um, and then I think that there's a lot of building that will have to be done. Like our economy is okay because that we have, also startup nation, and also because that we produce weapons and the entire world is going into this,
Unknown. Yeah.
mass, yeah,
Yeah.
this unknown. So everyone, like,
We're
countries
into
that
armed to
didn't
the
have
teeth.
armies are suddenly
Yeah.
establishing new armies, building armies. Yeah. So, but that's not sustainable. I mean, it could be sustainable for a few years, but that's not like, it's
Yeah.
not a good enough economy. And we have a lot of work that has to be done. And there's going to be a lot of PTSD, and a lot of, challenges that a lot of families are going to have to deal with. And we're going to have to be a very strong society and economy to deal with this. So I think that more than anything, it's like there are few these building blocks, and then there's a lot of just very patient and loving work that will have to be done in our society. Just, and I think there is a lot of love and a lot of people care for the country. So that's what keeps me optimistic. But the work, there will be a lot of work.
Yeah. So just to put a finer point on it, so if we don't do all this incredibly important work, where do we go? What happens? And then but I'm starting there because I want to end with what does it look like when we do this work?
Yeah. So once I met with ultra-Orthodox and I told them, listen, in Jerusalem, the ultra-Orthodox barely pay taxes. So in Jerusalem, people said, they won't be able to have us all leave, and the ultra-Orthodox won't be able to take over the city because then the non-ultra-Orthodox will leave the city and then they won't have the taxes. So obviously, we're tied together. And
Yeah.
what we realized is that once there were less and less non-ultra Orthodox in Jerusalem, and therefore there weren't enough taxes, suddenly they started taking taxes from Tel Aviv. Like the government changed the legislation. Now Tel Aviv and all of the non-ultra Orthodox cities have to transfer some of their budget to the ultra Orthodox cities because ultra Orthodox don't pay taxes. And I met with ultra Orthodox. I was like, so what's the okay? So this was the grand plan for Jerusalem. Okay, fine. But what will happen, when your numbers grow and if you continue not paying taxes and and it's not sustainable. So they said, so we'll leave the country. So what will happen if Israel will collapse? They're like, so we'll find a different country, we'll just move on. And so you're asking what will happen if we don't take care of these challenges. I think this group of very nice ultra Orthodox that sat with me for lunch at the time, when I was trying to understand it, they gave me the answer. Israel won't. Israel won't be able to deal with it today. The ultra Orthodox are 13% of Israeli society, and they're the
Birth
uh,
rate and their growth, their
birth rate
national
is
growth is,
very,
yeah.
very high. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so, we're talking about, and it's very fast and very rapid. Okay.
Yeah.
Like 20-year-old women start having children. They have 6 children, average 6 to 8 children. Like those, I think the average is 8. Sorry, the average is 8. It's like very, very high numbers, and it just keeps. So, and they just said, we'll leave. So, this is what we're looking towards. And the numbers are high, and then you don't have enough soldiers, and then you have there's the say in Israel, that a third of Israeli society pays the high taxes, third of Israeli society that goes to the army and miluim, and third of Israeli society volunteers. The problem, it's all the same third.
Same third. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
this third won't be able to carry on and do this for such a long time when the challenges are so big. And we're talking about challenges in the army, challenges in our economy, challenges everywhere.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. All right. So that's
if
devastating,
it,
bleak
yeah.
if we don't. So we have a lot of work. What does it look like when we do make the right
Oh, Israel
decision?
is a great country,
Yeah.
really a great country, and we have a lot of resilience, and we really, really, really know how to grow from very challenging times. So I do believe we'll be able to do it. It's not yet really clear to me how exactly it's going to happen, but I know that, we're willing to work very hard to make it happen, and that, a lot of people, as I said, there's a lot at stake. Like this country is very dear to a lot of us. Like my parents are immigrants. A lot of people, in Israel, you can't be many, many generations in Israel. So a lot of people made a big effort to come here and stay here and live here and build a house and family and get everything going. And we also, I think that as years go by, and I feel I'm surprised by how Israeli I am. Like my mother made Aliyah from the United States, and like I think I told you I was in the States for Z3, and I was surprised how Israeli I was and how I reacted to people in such of an Israeli manner. I was like, oh my God, And I think that there's this Israeliness that's, we also like it, and it's also very much who we are. And when we go abroad, we're surprised to see how different we are and how, we behave like Israelis. So I think that trying to get used to living in another country is going to be very hard for many of us. So I think that if we do the right things, Israel is a great country, and it would be a very, very nice and fun country to live in. So,
So Rachel, thank you so much. It's always a huge zchut and honor to speak to you and hear about all your remarkable work. If it's now with the HaOgen that's treating close to 40,000 families and this incredible and remarkable, network of volunteers, you were recognized by the president and
yeah.
got an
Oh, yeah.
award, which is
And I also say, if you come to Israel, come volunteer.
yes,
Okay, let us
yes,
know. Yeah,
yeah,
you can come and volunteer. And also say I have my own podcast, but it's in Hebrew. But I'll say it's
yeah.
called Parashat
Okay,
Drachim.
Yeah.
But I don't know if
Yeah,
anyone.
yeah. No, if you want to learn Hebrew and more about what's going on, you should certainly tune in and follow Achet on her socials. She's, a lot
Yeah.
of live updates of what's going on from someone who's on the ground and understands very deeply what Israeli society and the Israeli country and communities are facing. So again, thank you so much for joining us. This was for me a great pleasure and honor to host you on our very first episode of the Long
Mazal
Path
tov.
podcast. Yeah, it's very exciting. So thank you, and I look forward to continuing our conversations.
Okay, me too. Thank you, Amitai, and good luck.
That was an interesting conversation with Rachel Azaria. She, running HaOgen and telling us about her work. There's a bunch of points there that I was thinking about throughout the conversation that kind of linger and are staying with me. On one level, it was very interesting to hear about the different, I'd say, challenges and arguments that are happening inside Israel and the weeds and the politics of the ultra-Orthodox and the ramifications or the implications of having this long war and on the reservists and their families. That's something that kind of, there's a heartache there that isn't resolved, and it's going to take a while to figure it out. I left also questioning and asking, and maybe, there's certainly more to dig into this is around, besides the big picture kind of vision, which is really what you can reach in this length of conversation. What are the concrete steps, or what are part of the things that need to happen so that we are in a better place moving forward? I wish, I look forward to having more of those conversations. So the question that I have this week is, how do we think about creating a society that has the systems that allows members of our community that might have different values and see the world slightly differently than us, find their place to be part of our community in a way that contributes and allows all of us to benefit without watering down the differences, without changing who each one of us wants to be, in a way that's inclusive and productive. And I've been thinking about that, and we'll think about that, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it. Thank you for joining us for this week's Long Path podcast. I am Amitai Freeman. I had a great pleasure of sitting in conversation with my friend Rachel Azaria. I hope you found it as meaningful as I did. Please share this episode with your friends. Follow us on our different platforms. I want to thank, of course, our producer, Omri, for doing such a great job, and the rest of the team here in making this happen. I look forward to meeting you every week now and seeing you again in our next episode of the Long Path podcast. Thank you, and have a great day.